The NHL was founded in 1917, but prior to the National Hockey League in 1917, you had the National Hockey Association in 1909. The National Hockey Association could very well have still been the name of the league, if not for one man. And I've talked about that one man over the years. It's kind of become like a talking point on the channel. I'm sure it'll become a talking point again over the next few days here, because it's entertaining. It's quite entertaining how the NHL came to be. This again, the National Hockey Association was born out of the love Canada had for hockey, and it was all Canadian teams. The National Hockey Association. The National Hockey League would make inroads with the U.S., of course, and eventually most of its teams are in the U.S. But to begin with, the NHA, all Canadian. The jersey I'm wearing is an old Canadian standard dating back to, I think this was the 1909 jersey, although that would have been a sweater, and 1909, I probably weighed about 40 pounds. So 1911, the National Hockey Association makes their first change to the game that starts to resemble what we know now. Their rival league, the Pacific Coast Hockey Association, kept the rover position. The NHA did not. Now, the rover meant they had 6 skaters and 1 goaltender on the ice. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, that would be really crowded, you're correct. Part of the reason that the rover position was taken out. Also, they felt like players were skilled enough, they didn't really need the rover. The rover was basically there to support forwards or defensemen, whoever needed help in that moment. So when you hear people talking about a roving player or a player who plays like a rover, it means they play wherever. They're not necessarily bound to defense. They're not necessarily bound as an offensive player. Wherever they are needed, that's where they're going to go. So it's usually used as an insult, is what I found, but it's not necessarily meant as an insult when you say a player's more of a rover than a defenseman, but it definitely gets taken as an insult. So the rival league again was the Pacific Coast Hockey Association, and they did well. The PCHA did pretty well for a while there. And honestly, if the PCHA had been able to survive, we likely would have seen some kind of merger between the NHL and the PCHA. We'd have very different hockey histories if that had taken place. The Vancouver Millionaires could have just continued to exist from the 1910s right through until now. We might not have had a Vancouver Canucks. But World War I took its toll, obviously took its toll around the globe, but in terms of hockey, well, hockey's in its infancy. The pro leagues are in their infancy, so a lot of players end up going and serving in 1914, which caused problems with teams being able to fill rosters. Because obviously it's just how are you going to fill a roster when a lot of the guys who are amongst those that you'd be taking are either getting drafted or signing up and going overseas, right? So it does become a challenge to put teams on the ice, and it definitely hurt the bottom line for the NHA. In 1910, the league set a salary limit. So the most amount of money you could earn was $5,000, which in today's money, when I calculated it, $165,025.26. That's the maximum. So, that's good money, but comparatively speaking with today's players, the thing is, I could do that with the 70s. I could go back to the 70s and look at the top salaries, compare them to now, and it's not even close. So the NHA, in its first season, which was just in 1910, they have the Cobalt Silver Kings, great name. Haleyberry Comets, also great name. The Montreal Canadiens, you might have heard of them. Montreal Shamrocks, that's the only year the Shamrocks play. The Montreal Wanderers, who won the Stanley Cup that year. One crime of losing the NHA stats is when you look at the NHL's first year, you just see that the Montreal Wanderers building burnt down. And because it was, 6 games into the season, your reaction would be one of, well, that team didn't last very long. Actually, they won the Stanley Cup in 1910. The Ottawa Senators were in this league. So was the Renfrew Creamery Kings. If we're going to expand to 36 teams, can we get the Renfrew Creamery Kings back, please? I want some joy in my life. That would do it. 1910, 1911, we see the Cobalt Silver Kings and the Haleyberry Comets leave the league. So you've got the Canadiens, the Wanderers, the Senators, the Bulldogs, and the fantastically named Renfrew Creamery Kings. But they drop out for 1911, 1912. My guess is the name was just too awesome. They had to turn too many people away at the doors, and they had to fold up shop. But we have the Canadiens, the Wanderers, the Senators, and the Bulldogs. So the Wanderers win the first Stanley Cup of this league's history. The Stanley Cup predates this league, though. Ottawa Senators win it in 1911, and the Quebec Bulldogs win it in 1912. So 1912-1913, the Quebec Bulldogs become the first team in the NHA to repeat as Stanley Cup champions. Yep, looking for a dynasty, weren't they? And Quebec Bulldogs, again, when we're looking through hockey history, you don't hear a lot about them, but they were around for a while. So you have the Canadiens, the Wanderers, and the Senators still, but then you have two Toronto teams joining in. A Toronto team that did not have a surname. The Blue Shirts was the name given to them. And the Toronto Tecumsehs. So that's not an easy one to pronounce, or not necessarily pronounce, but not an easy one to write down and all that. But I don't think that name would fly today. Just because it doesn't really roll off the tongue. I mean, I guess it kind of does. Sure, Maple Leafs can change their name to the Tecumsehs and go, we're a brand new team. 1913, 1914, we have the Canadiens, the Wanderers, the Senators, the Bulldogs. The Toronto Blue Shirts win the Stanley Cup that year, just the Toronto team, because you also have the Toronto Ontarios. The most creative name in the history of hockey right there, the Toronto Ontarios. Probably a late night sitting around a table, a picture of being a really smoky atmosphere, and finally, Toronto Ontarios. Boys, we've got it. So 1914, 1915, the Ontarios become the Shamrocks. Why? Eddie Livingstone bought the team. Yep. The struggling Toronto Ontarios team becomes the Toronto Shamrocks. And so Eddie Livingstone's in the league. What could possibly go wrong with that? So the Canadiens, the Wanderers, the Senators, who win the Stanley Cup that year, are in the league. The Bulldogs, and there are two Toronto teams, including the Shamrocks. So for the Sens, that's their second Stanley Cup. 1915, 1916, the Montreal Canadiens win their first Stanley Cup as members of the NHA. The Wanderers, the Senators, the Bulldogs, and there's Toronto right there. Eddie Livingstone's team. Not for much longer. We'll get into it. 1916, 1917, Montreal repeats as Stanley Cup champions. And these two Stanley Cups are the reason why Montreal fans got mad at me ages ago when I did a Montreal history video. And I didn't include those Stanley Cups because I only included the NHL Stanley Cups. It's that interesting part of the Montreal Canadiens history, because what's interesting to me is that they don't acknowledge Avco Cups won by WHA teams, obviously, but technically those Stanley Cups were won by NHA teams, not NHL teams, technically, right? And I say technically because the only thing that changed was a letter. So the Wanderers, the Senators, the Bulldogs, Toronto's there, of course, run by Eddie Livingstone, and the Toronto 228th Battalion. Interesting story that. So there was a league fee that they had agreed to pay, and halfway through the season, they had to withdraw because it was a wartime thing, and they had stuff to do. They couldn't play hockey in the National Hockey Association. The NHA, the owners, classy move. They sued the battalion for the fee. I think it was a $3,000 fee. They didn't get it. So the judge decided it was more important to fight in a war to defend your country than to play hockey. So I could have told them that if they just called me. Wasn't around 1917 though. So the league's struggling financially. Obviously, the wars caused a lot of problems for a lot of people, and hockey's the last and the least of their concerns. This is not what the NHL would become, not making anywhere near that kind of money. But the Stanley Cup itself, it predates this league by well over a decade. 1892. Lord Stanley of Preston, the Canadian Governor General, donates a trophy to decide to be granted to the top ranking amateur club in Canada. So amateur being the key word here, and of course this is a league that was not an amateur league, so that would be changed. But there was a challenge system in place as well. So your Stanley Cup champion could be challenged by another team from another league or from a university. Just imagine if Michigan State goes, I think we could take the Florida Panthers. I think we could take whoever wins the Stanley Cup. And right now I think it looks like it's going to be Florida, but we'll see. Or say the Edmonton Oilers, right, if they win it. Or Dallas. It's not likely, but could be Dallas, I guess. And just imagine a team goes, yeah, we want to challenge them. And they challenge them. They play a game and see, does that team keep the Stanley Cup or does it go to the team from the other league? So the Kenora Thistles win it in 1907. And that's a key year because that's the last year before we get a split. We get a change in how the cup is awarded because the Allen Cup comes into existence in 1908. That is going to be granted to the amateur players. The pro players will now play for the Stanley Cup. So that separation takes place. The Allen Cup is still played for to this day. This year it was won by the Dundas Real McCoys. So there's a team for you. And this is that senior hockey that you see on the show Shoresy. The Allen Cup is what gets played for by senior hockey players. One of the things I respect about the show Shoresy is that it is kind of a love letter to senior hockey. And shows, that you're going to get some fights, you're going to get some goals. It's kind of fun. But yeah, the Allen Cup has existed for over 100 years, and do I wish there was more attention given to it? Yeah, kind of. I think that'd be kind of fun if there was, but again, I haven't done videos on the Allen Cup myself, so bad hockey guy. But in 1916, 1917, you've got your final year of the NHA. The Ottawa Senators looked to withdraw. They were having a hard time finding players and felt like, hey, we'll just withdraw for the year and we'll stay home. The rest of the league talked them into staying. The rest of the league basically said, look, just play through it. And we can help. The owners all kind of worked together, and if a team needed players, you could move players around. But eventually they decided Eddie Livingstone didn't need any of his players. So Eddie Livingstone buys the Toronto Ontarios in 1914. And within a year, he's already fighting with the other owners. Now, the other owners are squabbling with each other as well, but nowhere near as much as they're squabbling with Eddie Livingstone. He has to go. So by 1916, and this is while the NHA is still going on, Eddie Livingstone's already suing people. He's already suing people because he's kind of had enough of their garbage. And the fight between Livingstone and the National Hockey League would go on for a while. It'd go right into the 1930s, actually. So even though it starts in the National Hockey Association, it continues with the National Hockey League because it's the same thing. The NHA that you see on the board here is the infancy of the National Hockey League. It changes names because they didn't like Eddie Livingstone. It was the No Eddie Livingstone League. I will get into that because it is a fascinating story of Eddie Livingstone. And I still have all the books that I used for the last time I talked about Eddie Livingstone. But that's really why. And the National Hockey League, as it was in its infancy, almost didn't make it either. There were definitely times where it looked like the league could just shudder and not be able to continue. And so it is because we get into the Depression once you get into the 1920s, right? The lawsuit started with Eddie Livingstone in 1917. They all sit down, the other owners, and say, why don't we just start our own league? We just won't invite Eddie. And so Eddie got to keep the Toronto Shamrocks, but all of his players became those members of the Toronto Arenas, which is why when people talk about the 1917-18 Toronto Arenas and how that was an expansion team that won the Stanley Cup, technically, because the franchise was new, okay, but the only thing that really changed was Eddie was gone. It was the same arena, it was the same players, but Eddie was gone. That was the whole thing, was they had to get rid of Livingstone, and so they had somebody else owning the Toronto team that would win the Stanley Cup the following year. But it was all the same players that had played the year before. So to me, the expansion thing is weird. It would, just think about this. So right now the Arizona Coyotes have moved to Utah, right? But imagine if they moved to Phoenix and they were an expansion team, but they kept the jerseys, they kept the name, they kept everything. The only thing that changed is the owner. And then the entire league changed its name. So it changed to like what? The National Hockey Organization, the NHL. And Eddie Livingstone of today would be Alex Morello, and he'd get the NHL rights to the Coyotes. And there'd be a new team, and it'd be called the Phoenix Desert Dogs. And they'd still have all the same logos, all the same everything. And just go, these aren't coyotes, they're desert dogs. What are you talking about? Like, it just, that's how ridiculous to me it is when people are talking about how Toronto won as an expansion team back in 1918. Technically, yes, but same building, same team, same colored jerseys. Everything was the same, just different owner. So, absolutely bonkers, but we'll get into the birth of the NHL soon enough. As I get into the historical stuff, because we're right on the verge of the off season. Plus, since the NHL started in 1917, it's now 2024. For me to get all of it in, I kind of need to start these videos now, or I'll run out of time before the training camp gets started and all that other fun stuff. So there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below regarding the National Hockey Association that predates the National Hockey League, but it was the National Hockey League. Kind of, sort of. But yeah, let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.